All right, I guess we'll get started. Welcome, everyone. Thanks for being here. Just so you know, you're in the right place. This is the Role of the University in Food Justice panel. We appreciate everyone being here for the conference, of course, but especially on a Sunday morning. So the fact that you've carved out time early in the morning on a weekend says something about you. We're also thrilled that our speakers have done the same. So when very busy people carve out time that is valuable, we really appreciate it. So really excited that they are here. My name is Gary Adamkiewicz. I'm an assistant professor over at Harvard's T.H. Chan School of Public Health. I mostly do research looking at environmental health issues, mostly in low-income communities. My connection to the food world is both through doing some research on food access issues in low-income communities. I also am the co-director of the Farm to Fork class at Harvard's Extension School, where we try to look at all the implications of our food decisions, everything from personal health to climate change. Hard to do in one semester, but we try to cover that broad landscape. Before I introduce our speakers, our goal today is to look at the role of the university and in these important issues. I am, in a way, my connection to this issue is through what you might say is the traditional role of a university, in terms of teaching and research. But that's just one piece of the way a university can be influential or can play a role. And we hope that we'll touch on a lot of those issues during today's panel. So since these bios have been condensed into short form, I thought I'd just introduce our panelists by way of these bios. So Anim Steele is the executive director of the Real Food Challenge. Anim, so the goal of the Real Food Challenge, for those who aren't aware, is to redirect $1 billion of college food purchases toward local, fair, and sustainable sources. Prior to the Real Food Challenge, Anim led national initiatives at the Food Project in Boston and was a consultant with Economic Development Assistance Consortium. Anim holds a BA in Astrophysics and History from Williams College, which is by far my favorite dual major, astrophysics and history. You win some sort of prize for that. And a master's degree in public policy from Harvard's Kennedy School of Government. He is the recipient of a Prime Mover Fellowship for Movement Building and an Echoing Green Award for Social Entrepreneurship. Simca Horowitz is program director of Massachusetts Farm to School. Simca is the program director for Massachusetts Farm to School, where she provides training to farmers and food service professionals and works on food system policy. Simca has worked in food and agriculture organizations in the Boston area for over 10 years, including as a farmer and farm-based educator at a community farm and running a shared-use community kitchen for culinary entrepreneurs. Simca holds an MS in food and agriculture policy from Tufts Friedman School of Nutrition, Science, and Policy. And Sophie Ackoff is a national field director of the National Young Farmers Coalition, a network of farmers, ranchers, and supportive consumers fighting for the future of farming. While a biology and environmental studies student at Wesleyan, Sophie founded a campus food politics organization to source local produce and meat in cooperation with dining services and local Connecticut farmers. She has worked for Food and Water Watch in education and outreach and has farmed on several CSA farms in the beautiful Hudson Valley of New York. So you can see why we're thrilled to have our panelists here today. We know this will be an interesting session for all of you, and I'll turn it over to Anim to start.
Great, thank you, Gary. And thanks everyone for being here. It's like a great room. I think we're going to do just a 5 to 10 minutes each of introduction, just to set the stage and then open it up. And so, Shub, if you could give me a signal around whenever we agreed upon, that would be great, so we don't leave lots of time for discussion. So just thinking about the role of university in food and food justice and injustice, I thought, for me, it's helpful to think about it through the story of one Thomas Clarkson, who was a student at Cambridge University in England in 1780s. And around 1785, he was in his final year, and he entered a contest to write an essay in Latin. That was the big thing at the time, was the Latin essay. And the question that was given to the contestants was, is it lawful to hold someone in slavery against their will? And this was the time of when almost every Briton, let alone American, was daily participating in food injustice in the form of the tea that they drank, or increasing the sweets that were produced, because the sugar that was coming from that was coming from slave plantations in the West Indies. And so I look around, so I just see, I noticed some people drinking tea or coffee with a nice Equal Exchange logo there. So everyone can rest easy. He was particularly thorough in doing this, in writing this essay. He wasn't philosophical. He went down to the docks. He interviewed sailors who had been on slave ships. He really went into the records. And his thoroughness probably helped him to win this essay. And so he's at Cambridge. He's collected his prize. He's actually kind of graduated and is going on to his life and presumably great career in the Church of England. He's riding off to London. And along the way, instead of like thinking about how great it was that he won this really prestigious prize, he's thinking about what he's learned in the process, and the kind of the horrors of the transatlantic slave trade, both for the Africans who were captured as well as for the Britons who worked on slave ships. It was all around terrible. And then he gets on and off his horse. He's really kind of obsessed with it. And at one point, he dismounts and he goes off and kneels by the side of the road. And he says to himself, if the contents of this essay are true, it's time someone put an end to these calamities. And if the contents of this essay are true, it's time someone put an end to these calamities. The calamities, the crimes of the transatlantic slave trade. And he dedicates himself at that point to starting what was at the time the very first human rights campaign in the world, which also happened to be the first food campaign in the world, because it was a boycott of slave sugar that really kicked off this abolitionist movement. And the author of this book, Adam Hochschild, who it's in the book called Buried in the Chains, says if there was any moment at which the demise of slavery was inevitable, it was that moment when that young man coming out of college kneeled down and dedicated himself to this cause. And so I think about that because I think it kind of encapsulates the two really broad possibilities for universities and their role in justice and injustice. One is that they can be perpetuate or participate in and perpetuate injustice. And in the case of the 1780s, especially in the Americas, that's extremely clear, because there's an enormous amount of wealth that's being generated with the relationship with the West Indies and with slavery. And so even here at Harvard Law School, I don't know if it came up yesterday, that Harvard Law School in the 1780s was founded by a gift from the royal family who had plantations in Antigua. So this very building was the product of slave plantation sugar wealth. And of course the whole, not just the universities, but the whole society was shaped around it. So the codfish industry was often going to feed slaves in the West Indies, and a lot of New England wealth was being generated from that. So even when people didn't participate directly, it was there. So that's on one hand, the universities benefiting from injustice, and on the other hand, they have this role in questioning injustice and sometimes confronting it, as exemplified by Thomas Clarkson. So just coming back to today, I think it's not just that there was this historical benefit, and that's something we need to look at. There's an ongoing interaction between universities and injustice, and so daily students are, of course, eating food which has come from conditions that are not just. And the Real Food Challenge was founded with the sense that $5 billion worth of food purchases by universities in the U.S. Are tied with a food system which is not fair or not ecological, and often not healthy. And so our thought was, we shouldn't just think about this injustice, which is really important, and that questioning role is key. Let's also do something with the direct dollars that we're spending, and so that's how our goal of shifting at least $1 billion within 10 years came about. So why don't I stop there and pass it on? Thank you.
Great. So thank you again, everyone, for being here. I think that's a kind of a great segue, because what I'm going to talk about is a sort of much more on the ground kind of what it looks like to try and actually get institutions to really be leaders in this space of transforming our food system. So I'm going to give just like a very brief kind of overview of what Massachusetts Farm to School does. Actually, cool. And try and do it while sitting here. I may need to turn my head a bit. There we go. Okay. So we were founded about a little over 10 years ago, really as an economic development agent for Massachusetts farmers.
Is it possible to dim the lights for those of us with weak eyeballs?
Where the lights are. And at a time when there was really significant loss of agricultural land, the Pioneer Valley in Massachusetts is some of the most fertile, incredible agricultural soils in the world. So really devastating when that land gets moved out of agriculture. And so the thought was that schools, everything from preschool through K12 schools, colleges, and other institutions like hospitals could really be a game changer in this space and provide new market opportunities for farmers who are struggling. And so a lot of the work we do is really direct technical assistance with farmers about how to access this market, and then also with food service staff about how to start using locally grown product that may be arriving in a different format than they're used to from a really conventional supply. And as I said, we do this really to motivate it initially from this place of trying to really foster a vibrant regional food system that is viable for and profitable for our farms, but also to really look at schools and institutions as a place of healthy food access, so that really everybody should be able to access local foods if it's going into the public school system. And the reason, I think Anim certainly touched on this, of why our focus is on institutions is really because of what market drivers they can be, that they offer a diversified market to farmers, and they are serving millions of meals and millions of dollars worth of food each year. And increasingly, we've really been doing a lot of work regionally. So although we are a state-based organization, we work throughout New England because, and in particular with a group called Farm to Institution New England, and really because in our region, that is what makes sense. If you take a look at the U.S. and how New England compares to the rest of the country, it is quite small. And particularly here in Massachusetts, we have a whole lot more eaters than we have land. And up in the northern part of New England, there's a lot more land and a lot fewer eaters. So it makes a lot more sense to really be moving product throughout the region and providing as much locally grown food as we can to institutions in our region. And if you look at the businesses operating in this space, from produce distributors or other distributors, they're not stopping at state boundaries. So as an advocacy organization, it doesn't necessarily make sense for us to do that. And a lot of what we're looking at is how to help institutions really think about values-based purchasing. So not that it's not enough to say, local. We found that for a lot of folks, local is sort of a stand-in for particular kinds of values, and I think this is something that Real Food Challenge certainly gets at in looking to folks to purchase things that are just. That is a value. Then are ecologically raised, again, a value. So when people say, oh yeah, we want to increase the amount of local, a lot of what we're starting to shift to is to say, okay, what does that mean for you? Why are you interested in purchasing local foods? Is it because you want to keep money in your local economy? Is it because you want to know more about the working conditions of the farms that you're buying from? Because you want to know about the environmental impacts of the ways in which that farm is growing? So really encouraging schools and institutions to figure out what the values are that are going to guide their purchasing decisions, and then helping them make sure that that's something that is really understood throughout the whole institution. So not that it's coming exclusively from a position of leadership, but that the people who are receiving food at the loading dock understand what these values are, so that they can help really communicate them all the way up the line to the folks preparing the food, people putting it out on a cafeteria or dining hall line, and so that the consumers can really understand what the values are that have gotten the food to their plate. And so I thought I would just kind of touch on where we see things going, because I think that's part of what's really exciting about this work, and where there's a lot of growth. So you'll see in the middle, it's a butcher, and you know, when the local food movement, I think people in institutions, people often think, oh, you're talking about fruits and vegetables. And that's certainly part of it, but I think where we're seeing a lot of growth is definitely in people looking to sort of the center of the plate, and where a lot of money is going currently to meats and seafood and other proteins that are really you know, not traceable, not necessarily raised in the way that are meeting the values that they've set forth for something like produce, and where there's a lot of opportunity, particularly in this region. You know, here in Boston, we are in a like seafood capital, and so to really think about how institutions can help us maintain a really viable fishing industry that's also ecologically sound, is institutions have a big role to play in that. And also in the bottom corner you see these veggie fries from Northern Grill, which is a processor up in Maine that makes little veggie fries out of root vegetables. And again, I think it's about pushing the needle for local foods purchasing to make it something that's happening year-round. And in this region, a way to do that is to process and freeze foods, because it still snows at the end of March, and we need to figure out how to be keeping our food to be able to consume it year-round. So there's a lot of, I think, exciting movement in this space, and universities can really be at the forefront of it. And I just want to give a quick plug. If this is something you're super interested in, you can keep learning about it in a week at this Farm to Institution Summit out at UMass Amherst, which is going to be a great experience. Oop, and here you go.
Great. I'm going to move this a little closer. So I'm particularly excited to be here because my career in agriculture started at a university and not an agricultural college, but a liberal arts college that had an on-campus student-run organic farm that was 2 acres, where I made all my first mistakes. And I think this generation of farmers that I represent, we're not coming from family farms, the majority of us, and we're discovering farming in universities. So universities have a big role to play in helping spawn the next generation of farmers, but also are contributing to one of our major challenges, which is student loan debt. So I wanted to introduce our coalition, the National Young Farmers Coalition, and tell you about our latest campaign to tackle the huge barrier of student loan debt. So we are a national coalition of young and beginning farmers all across the country who believe there should be fewer obstacles to starting a farm. So we are organized. We're getting organized to tackle these challenges head on. And we started in 2010 in the Hudson Valley of New York, which is where I farm and organize. There was a group of farmers at that time who are really struggling to find affordable farmland to grow their farm businesses. And they looked around for an organization that was out there to help them, and no one was working specifically on the needs of young and beginning farmers in the U.S. So they thought, who better to represent the needs of young farmers than young farmers ourselves? And at that point, there were groups of farmers organizing in Washington State and Michigan and Connecticut, and they came together and decided that they needed a national coalition to leverage their voices as young farmers to make change at the national scale. So the Farm Bill was the first campaign. We need a voice in the Farm Bill. For those of you who aren't aware, it's reauthorized every 5 years. It dictates all of our ag and food policy in the U.S. And young farmers really didn't have a voice in the process. So we set out to change that, and we built relationships with our elected officials, and we wrote legislation, and we got a lot of things changed in the Farm Bill that came out in 2014. So it took 4 years for the bill to pass, but we helped save $20 million of funding for beginning farmer training programs. We started a microloan program with the USDA to make sure that beginning diversified farmers can access capital. And we changed the program that gives funding to land trust to protect farmland to make sure that farm viability is in the definition of that program, so that land that's being conserved isn't just protected from development but stays in the hands of working farmers. So I kind of want to, so those are our victories, and I want to set the scene of where we are with young farmers in the United States right now. In 2010, USDA Secretary Tom Vilsack said we need 100,000 new farmers in the next 5 years. But from 2007 to 2012, we added about 1,200 new principal operators, so we're falling really short of that goal. And we're in a time of incredible land transition. 2/3 of our farmland is changing hands the next 25 years, so we need an army of young people who are trained in farming and ready to take on this opportunity to grow food for their communities. And luckily, we have this new movement. Young people are interested and excited to start farming, but they're facing a lot of challenges: land, credit, capital, and student loans. And the first thing we did as a coalition is we did a survey of 1,000 young farmers all across the country, and we're about to do a survey part 2 this year, so I'm excited to see how that's changed. And we found that 78% of farmers are not coming from farm families. So they are experiencing a whole unique set of challenges in that they're not inheriting land, they're not inheriting strong farmer networks, they don't know how USDA works. And because of this, they're going to college and discovering farming at university. So we need pathways for farmers to go to college and then be able to farm afterwards. And farming is a really capital-intensive career, and we found that in our survey, the #1 challenge was access to capital for starting a farm business. So student loans are standing in the way of success. We've heard from the beginning this is a major obstacle, and we've wanted to work on it since our founding. Farmers are either not able to meet their monthly loan payments on a farm income, especially when you graduate from college and need to have an apprenticeship and are just paid, a couple $100s a month. So they're either, not able to even start farming or, get trained in agriculture and then realize that they can't pay down their debt while farming. And then the second obstacle is that once you do have a farm business, it's really hard to leverage capital to grow that business when you have existing debt. It's already almost impossible to get loans for building farms. And if you have a lot of existing debt, it just makes it that much harder. And even farmers who are going to ag school are graduating and not being able to farm because they can't afford it. So we're not even graduating enough students from ag school to become farmers, so we need the ones that are to be able to afford to farm. So we're seeing an entire generation that's really trapped by this student loan debt. Luckily, the Higher Education Act is up for reauthorization this year, so we have a perfect opportunity to fix this problem. How many people have heard of the Public Service Loan Forgiveness Program? Great, yeah, so if you are in a public service career like teaching, medicine, law, nonprofits, and government, you can apply to this program, and you make 10 years of income-based payments, and the rest of your loans are forgiven. So we think that farming is a public service, and farmers should be added to this program. Farming provides incredible benefits to our communities. It provides one of our most basic needs, which is food. Farmers steward 1 billion acres of land, which is half of the acreage in the U.S., and we're, of course, supporting our rural economies. So we really feel strongly about adding farmers to this program. And because 71% of college graduates are graduating with debt, that really limits the amount of farmers we can have. If having debt means you can't farm, we need these smart, driven, educated folks to get into the field. And so this program is really great because it does incentivize people to become career farmers. You do have to put in your 10 years, but it's all about income-based payments. So instead of paying $400 a month for your student loans on a farming income, it can go even down to $0 a month. But you don't have to worry about all the interest that's accumulating because at the end of that 10 years, it would be forgiven. A lot of farmers, we did a survey. We had like 600 responses from farmers in our network about how student loans are affecting them. And this, it's totally overwhelming to read the stories. People, every time if they're on income-based, when they think about the interest that's accumulating, they have panic attacks. This is really affecting folks. So we think, the government needs to step up and realize that we're in a farmer crisis and address this by adding farmers to the program. And we think it's a really incredible way to incentivize young people to pursue agriculture. Leave it at that.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of area here. We thought we'd start by just opening it up for questions, and we can also try to have a dialogue between our speakers, but I'm sure...
Oh, I forgot my slide. There you go.
Oh.
We can just leave it at that, but with the lights on. So, yeah, great.
So I'm sure there's interesting questions.
If I might ask two, one of them is a very short answer.
Mm-hmm.
Sir, what was the name of the book that you mentioned?
Oh, it's called Bury the Chains.
Bury the...
Rebels and, well, that's the main title. And the author is Adam Hochschild. Mm-hmm.
And a little bit of a more long answer question. I work at Eastern Market in Detroit, which is a pretty major food hub in the Great Lakes region. And we've actually been having a lot of discussions about how so many of our farmers are aging out of their farms and their children are not interested in taking over their farms, nor does it seem there are enough people who are interested in taking over their farms. So I was wondering, do you also do outreach to junior high and high school age people?
Not yet. I think a lot of those people might be accessing our resources online, and we have a series called the Bootstrap Blogs where we feature farmers in their first season starting a farm, and they write each month about their experiences. And we made, last year was all women dairy farmers, and we made videos of them talking about their new farms. And so our hope is that it's reaching a broad audience, but right now we're really focused in on, like 18 to 35-year-olds who have made the decision to farm and make sure that they're finding success in it, because we believe that once young people see other young people having good careers in farming and making money and being able to support their families, then that will become an option for them. But we would love in the future to get more hands-on with younger people.
Anim, I'm wondering if you'd talk a little bit about how you guys hope to shift that $1 billion from in the next 10 years. Some of the specific ways that you hope that can happen.
Yeah.
Our first focus is on connecting and inspiring and supporting students. Our general approach is that it's going to take partnership. It take many kinds of people within the university and in the community, and then we also recognize, well, our particular role is to help students become drivers and supporters of that change. So we sometimes go to campuses, we hold trainings where students from different campuses come together, and the focus of that is to develop the analysis of the power structure of the university, to understand the food system, and to be able to come back to campus and run a campaign that for which the goal is a commitment signed by the university president and also signed by the dining service director to commit to at least 20% of their food purchases coming from real food. And so the second part of that, besides securing that commitment, is defining and measuring real food. So students can use the definition that we've developed and the tool that we've developed called the Real Food Calculator to actually go get invoices from the school and audit and assess their school's purchases. And we have over 100 universities, or students at 100 universities are doing that work right now. So it's building also the knowledge base of, what does it look like to do this at Johns Hopkins, which committed to 35% real food a year or two ago, down in the Mid-Atlantic compared to University of Santa Cruz. So those are the two, increasing transparency and increasing the commitment. I guess that's the basics of it. And I think the last thing and there's a lot more in there, but I think it would be amiss right now not to also mention that most universities in the country outsource their dining services. And there are 3 big companies that have those contracts, have most of the contracts. And so they're also a really important factor in this. And I think the next, for us, much of the next 5 years is going to be working in relationship to those companies and hopefully pushing them to do more than they are.
Can I just follow that with, do you know where Harvard fits into this picture?
I'm since there might be some Harvard students here, and maybe I'll defer to someone who knows more.
Sure, I can talk a little bit about it, and then yeah. So Harvard is a self-operated dining program, so a bit set apart from those 3 companies, but a lot of the same issues. So one of the things that I think we find in working with both campuses that have food service management companies and ones that are self-operating is they may be working with all of the same vendors. So even if they have a different sort of corporate structure operating dining, a lot of the issues are the same, and a lot of the issues around transparency in particular are really the same, because a lot of what comes down to is they're even if they want to report out what they're doing about purchasing, they're not getting sufficient information from their vendors. At Harvard. I think there's been a lot of local purchasing happening for many years. A lot of that is definitely produce, and it's generally working direct with distributors as opposed to any sort of direct purchasing from farms. And I think, as sort of this conference attests, there's definitely a lot of interest around these issues, and particularly, I think, really recently. And maybe Liz can talk about any sort of student organizing that's happening.
Sorry. Well, I'm a ground organizer of the Real Food Challenge. I'm not a student here, but I support the Real Food Harvard campaign. They are currently running the Real Food Calculator on Harvard's invoices, and it's not finished, so can't speak to the outcome of like the percentage of real food that Harvard is purchasing right now. The students have been working here on and off for the last 4 or 5 years to increase transparency, and we're going to hopefully be launching a really strong commitment campaign, if not next month, in the next semester.
And just in a sort of operations level, at Mass Farm to School, we're doing some work with a group of campuses in the Boston area specifically to look at what opportunities there might be for kind of collaboration across campuses to really push the supply. So working with about 5 different colleges to really look at how they may be able to communicate what the aggregated demand is for certain things that they're currently not sourcing, that the supply might not even exist. So one of the things we were doing was just looking at, with all of those campuses, saying, okay, in particular product areas where you're not sourcing something that's either got any sort of sustainability criteria or sourced regionally, like how much are you using, what would you want? And how can we tell the producers about that? So in a concrete example, there was a lot of interest. A lot of universities use a lot of shredded cheese, pizza, that sort of thing. And Cabot is a dairy cooperative that people are really interested in purchasing from. They weren't shredding their cheese for an institutional market and sort of institutional pack size. And we asked the campuses, okay, how much you use over a year? And it's in the I think thousands and thousands of cases, like tens of thousands of cases. And that's they are now going to start shredding cheese. So that's great. It's a little win. So that's where you can get on the really granular level of what, individual product shifts, but you need that voice advocating for it and students saying, this is the kind of food that we want. So I think that's where the organizing goes really hand in hand in terms of creating the demand and then helping dining services actually solve the problem.
Yeah. And I just want to add, as a student organizer, I went to a Real Food Challenge training, and I got the grassroots organizing skills that I needed to get my college president to sign the commitment and work with Bon Appetit, which is our dining service at Wesleyan, to purchase more locally, but also to support our farm. So they pay for student labor to grow greens all year round for our dining hall. And they also buy the greens, so they're double supporting the student farm. But it wouldn't have been possible without Real Food Challenge's direction and encouragement and empowerment.
I can pass the mic to the next person.
Thanks. Yesterday I went to the wonderful panel on the workers in the poultry factories and was just, appalled to hear about how awful the conditions are. And so I wonder, does Harvard get their chicken from a place like Tyson Foods? And if so, how can we, convince them not to?
Well, I don't know the specifics of how much, and I don't want to put anyone in the spot. We may have some Harvard dining folks in the room, so feel free, anybody operations, to answer this. But several of the campuses we've been working from are purchasing from Murray's Chicken up in Vermont, Maine. But chicken is a big issue. So I've been doing a lot of work with UMass Amherst, which has signed the Real Food Campus Commitment. They're already at, they've already sort of exceeded the % of their food budget that they're spending on local. They're really a national leader in this front. And they said, we want to get better chicken. And so we started thinking like, okay, what does this look like? So they serve 17,000 meals a day. And for purely, they were like, okay, let's look at our rotisserie chicken, which is like a very small part of the amount of chicken they're serving. It's just the things that they're like, roasting whole. And they were going to need 50 birds a day just for rotisserie chicken. There's not that supply in their definition of a regional supply. It just doesn't exist. So part of what that's sort of this issue of communicating what this demand is so that we can shift the supply, because it is not there for particularly a lot of these things like protein. So even when people are wanting to serve a better product and are willing to commit a price that would enable them to purchase it, it's not available in the region.
Hi, I went to Cornell undergrad, and I was very active there trying to get bottled water off of campus, which is not quite the same thing, but addressed a lot of similar challenges. And one of which was that they were Cornell was locked into a contract with PepsiCo, and I mean that was part of the challenge was that students are on campus for 4 years when they're campaigning for stuff. Sometimes it takes many years, and how do you keep that momentum going? I'm happy to say that they've made a lot of progress since I graduated 5 years ago, but it was really challenging being there and not being able to change anything. And they also, it was when we were talking to the administration, there was the financial side of things, like they were making money from the sales, and we had a hard time selling it. We said you are a leader, you have a responsibility, and over time they kind of bought into it. But those are some challenges we faced, and so I think that parallels probably some of these same issues. And so I'm also, I don't know what if you have any, if you want to talk about how to address some of those challenges, and then also, you talked about this. Who is going to supply this? Because I know like local food hubs are growing as kind of aggregators of local farmers, because a lot of them don't have the scale to supply this, and there is that growing incentive as a guaranteed market. But yeah, I guess like what are the logistics of it all? You talked about the chickens, but like I'm sure like Sodexo gets their bananas from Dole, which I'm sure does not meet the local more sustainable requirement, so that's it.
I wouldn't mind hitting on some of that contract issue, but you brought up a question first that I'd like to throw to Sophie.
Yeah, I feel like each of you can kind of.
Yeah, which is, I'm actually curious as in the beginning farmer stage, I understand that that debt, access to land, the financing is most important. I'm curious for the farmers that which is only a subset of certain farmers, how much a signal from a university or hospitals in an area, institutions can affect your decision what to grow or what to raise. Does that happen yet for the farmers or is that at a later stage? Or
Yeah, so it's all about price point, especially when starting out. The reason that young farmers are finding so much success is that they're able to sell direct to consumers. CSAs and farmers markets have become so popular that they can get a price that supports their farming practices, because individual consumers are really concerned about the type of chicken that they're eating and want to make sure it's pastured and all that. There's a growing interest in selling to institutions. I'd say more among fruit and vegetable growers who can get to that scale more easily. And at that point, either you need to be a mid-scale grower to make that quantity, to make the price point worth it, or you mentioned aggregation, which is a great model, which is farmers working together either by creating a co-op or a business that is aggregating for farmers that makes it possible to sell in larger quantities. But I do think that the movement among young farmers to sell to institutions is more in fruit and vegetables because it's so difficult to rate. Farmers aren't making really any money off of selling chicken. It's really intensive, all the inputs, and organic feed is really expensive. Our coalition in the Hudson Valley, we have a buying club of livestock growers who want non-GMO grain, and it's to get organic grain for chickens, it's really expensive, and so we work together to buy from Vermont and share, the delivery costs and share bulk pricing by working together. And now we have actually convinced a local GMO farmer to transition for us because he knows that the market is there and we've expressed interest, and so we'll get local organic grain. So we're just, keeping working to make it possible to grow chicken, and then further down the line being able to sell to bigger markets.
On the contract issue, I guess I'll just say that this is a real big learning curve for us, and I think where I think a lot of the frontier of where we're going to go is as Real Food Challenge. That's because there are so many deals in the background, as you were alluding to, that are not visible to most of us as consumers at an institution or or actually wherever, that I think help to set the stage for what some of us would feel like is not a really actual competitive environment, or at least it's becoming increasingly that way. So an example, you gave one example. The other example is volume rebates that a company like Sodexo or Aramark would have with their vendors or suppliers. So like PepsiCo or Tyson is going to pay Sodexo, they're going to give them a check at a certain point, based on how much they buy, right? And you call it a volume rebate, you call it a kickback, and that arrangement favors bigger companies that can give bigger rebates, and it favors processed food for whatever reasons, fresh products, whether it's vegetables or meats, and are less included in those deals. And that practice has grown a lot in the last 20 years and is becoming not just like a deal sweetener, as far as we can tell, it's increasingly becoming the business. And so there's even the prospect, I can't claim this, we don't have the full research yet. It's possible that universities are paying more for actual lower quality food because the difference between what they're paying, because there's a part that's going straight to the companies, not to the universities. It's a little complicated to get into, and it may come up a little bit in a workshop this afternoon, very little bit. But Liz is leading a workshop that may go a little bit more into this. But that's just an example of, there's a lot more, and the more we can, especially at public institutions where some of this should be more accessible, raise this as an issue, the more I think we're going to get people are going to be upset and want to change the system.
I think that's also why we think keeping K-12 schools in this conversation is particularly important, because it's like all public money, federal dollars being spent for the lunch program, and a lot of that money is going back to multinational corporation. And there is some states have done some policy work to actually basically legislate that money has to stay in the district, as opposed to going back to the food service contractor. So I think there's an opportunity there where for a sort of really strong reasoning for making it more transparent and that it's all public money.
Well, I was wondering if this seems to be a lot of ground organizing. Do you have examples of where maybe the initiative or like the initial push to change the university dining or something has started at like the higher level, maybe from the president or some kind of climate neutrality signing or something. Do you have any idea if that's happening, or is it mostly really about what we're doing here on the ground to influence higher up?
Actually, before I say that, there was a question about bananas, or a reference to bananas in there. And I see that, I think, possibly the foremost expert in banana person at universities happens to be in the room. So Hannah from UMass is there. So if anyone has questions about bananas and fair trade bananas and different kinds of fair trade bananas and all that, ask Hannah. So sorry, back to the question about where is the initiative coming from within universities in particular. I've definitely seen some cases where administration and faculty and dining services are incredibly proactive. Most of what I think about in terms of really getting to a solid commitment ends up coming from students, at very least, like taking it all the way, if not from the initial spark. And I think that, well, I think Johns Hopkins is an example. Johns Hopkins University, which I mentioned before, has a really great dining director. He's really committed to this, to better food, to real food, local food, sustainable food. And then the contract came up. They had Aramark as a food service provider. And then that contract was in a period of renewal, right? So the students at that time were also really looking at real food. And because the students had started campaigning and realized that this contract was a pressure point and focused on it, and because the faculty helped us at the Center for Livable Future, which is part of Johns Hopkins, helped us bring a conference there, and we went out and we petitioned, and we got lots of signatures from students. We were able to make a case that we wanted real food standards to be in the contract. And they switched from Aramark to Bon Appetit, and they went from, in 1 year, from several percentages of real food to 20%. I'm saying that there were lots of faculty, students, and the president of the university who came to the signing commitment and upped the commitment from 30% to 35% on the spot. Like, all had a role, but without the students really pushing, it wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, and you mentioned carbon neutrality, and that at Wesleyan was also a student movement, but that then was a good partnership with the Real Food Challenge initiatives. I also think the role of the dining service is really interesting, and especially in the case of Bon Appetit, because they have a corporate culture of like competing against each other because they have contracts in all of these schools across the country. And at least my dining service director wanted to beat the other dining service provider at a different school that was building hoop houses at their farm to grow greens in the winter. So when we brought it up, he's like, "Oh yeah, like my colleague's doing that. Like we should build more," So I think working off that was exciting, and probably not necessarily the case at Sodexo and Aramark. And I also wanted to mention the role of faculty in the process. So student organizing is so powerful, but we found a lot of really incredible help from faculty that was interested and wanted to help us reach administrators in making change. So.
Hi all, I'm a visiting researcher here. So thanks a lot for your presentation. You're doing a great job and it's fascinating. I just have two aspects that I would like you to talk a little bit more about. And the first one is that of food waste. And I was wondering if you're involved in like also dealing with the food waste, the food that you are providing to institutions and universities is generating. And the second one is that of sustainability and the environmental impact of the food that you are procuring. So yesterday was a fascinating screening, Cowspiracy, about the environmental impact of meat production. And I noticed in the presentation that you gave that there was a lot of emphasis on meat and fish and fishing as like where money is and the future. So I was just wondering, and also connecting with bananas and long trade transportation and the environmental implications of that, how you are accounting for that in the kind of food that you're thinking for the future of these institutions?
I guess I can speak a little bit to the meat and fish question in institutions. I think we're definitely seeing people think a little bit about sort of better quality but less volume of meat purchasing, so that you may be willing to pay a bit more for something that is sustainably produced, but you're actually, people are consuming less of it, which it's both produced in a way that has less negative environmental impact, but then just overall meat consumption going down. And with the seafood, a lot of the workarounds getting more seafood into institutions in this region is about using underutilized species, which really need to be marketed often to actually get students thinking about wanting to eat redfish as opposed to expecting there to be salmon. And part of that, I think, really is where it ties into maintaining a strong local economy. Like, the fishing industry in this region is really in crisis, and the ability to actually market things that there's an abundance of and move away from overfishing species that we really shouldn't be fishing anymore, that institutions can play a role in really creating a demand for those things that are here in abundance, and creating a stable price, because it's an incredibly volatile market, the seafood industry. And food waste. I'm like, what was the other thing? Food waste, I think, is something we only, I think, in to a small degree, work on with institutions, but there's incredible potential to really make a really quite significant difference in terms of the amount of waste generated. Massachusetts just last year passed a new law, an organic waste diversion law, basically requiring institutions that generate over a certain amount of food waste to divert that from landfills and into like composting. And I think the challenge right now is that we actually don't have the industry to support all of that food really getting composted in the way that it should be. So there's a real business opportunity there, and something that I think we're at the early stages of. But there are some models of institutions, I think, doing really great work on this front, and including from Boston University, which is in the room. I don't know if you want to speak to that at all, but or if you guys have other stuff to add.
Can I add something to the Massachusetts law, the effect it's had on Harvard, for example, to avoid these fines or whatever costs of recycling? I forget what the amount is, but a huge amount of food waste is produced by Harvard every day. Mm-hmm. So now they're flash freezing the food and distributing it to various soup kitchens and food justice programs in the area. So it's a small step, and it's at least it's a little more palatable, excuse the expression, than just throwing stuff out.
Yeah.
So.
And there's food waste on this end, kind of the more consumer end. There's also food waste at the production end as well. And we're involved in a research program in Minnesota to assess the possibility of using produce seconds. Those are fruits and vegetables which are deemed not viable for commercial, for retail, right? They wouldn't look good on the shelf, but they could be processed and chopped up in the cafeteria. Unfortunately, the way the pricing works, they get priced at the retail level. So they often get wasted. Farmers, it's an incredible loss actually for many farmers. It just gets plowed under. Not only don't they sell it, they also invested, seed and space into growing it. So what if we could find a market for those produce seconds, so farmers now get revenue for it, and the university gets actually a lower price for processed goods. That's a project we started with the USDA and some partners in Minnesota.
Yesterday I was watching the movie about the tomato pickers, right? And
it's pretty astonishing that the government in a country like this, or any country for the matter of fact, allows tomatoes or whatever, peaches or anything you want, to rot, okay, in the ground, because the market does not want to pay the price. So where does the ethic, value comes in here, Because I see absolutely no connection between being a capitalist system that rules over the human being, right? So they interview the farmers. The farmers say, well, what can I do about this? The market does not want to pay the price that I need. I mean, for me to hire, people here to pick the tomatoes is more expensive than what the market wants to do. Now, isn't that about time that we change these rules a little bit so we proclaim that it is illegal, to do such a thing, and that we make social justice prevail? For instance, I come from Brazil, and in Brazil, the amount of food that rot in the trees, in the fields, is amazing. And why is that so? Because they want to keep the prices as high as they can. If they can sell a pound of tomato for $10, why should they sell it for $1, right? So I think there's an element here that's missing, in terms of social justice intervention. That's what I see. I'd like to hear from you,
Well, I would encourage everyone to join the Coalition of Immokalee Workers in Florida. I think they're doing incredible farmer organizing to raise the price for tomatoes so they can earn a living wage. I think we don't work directly on industrial scale tomato production, so I don't think I have much more to add then. I really recommend the Coalition of Immokalee Workers.
I thought, Molly, do you have a response to that?
No,
okay.
Not to that.
Oh, I thought you might. I think you highlighted the problem really well, and it goes back a little bit to saying that sometimes that we have an image of like this perfectly functioning market, and there are so many things inside of it that are inefficient, even from the kind of the viewpoint of a raw capitalist mentality. So I think we're about changing a lot of that.
I would agree completely. My question was on something different, and I had to step out for just a few minutes, so if you've already talked about this, just tell me, we've been there, done that. But I wanted to go back to that question about farmer training and how this doubling of the number of farmers that we have in this country, tripling at least, I would say, is what we need. How that's going to come about. I am not so sure that it makes sense for farmers to be going through liberal arts programs. And I am very sure it doesn't make sense for farmers to be going through many of the land-grant university programs that exist in this country still, because those are teaching farmers a kind of farming that really is not suitable for the future. There's too much business as usual still in the land-grant university system. We don't see it quite as much here in New England because our land-grant universities have a bit more freedom from the commodity industry, since agriculture is not such a big business here. But in the Midwest, it's still really, really hard to study or do agroecology, which makes so much more sense than industrialized farming for the future. And I'm wondering what you guys think about that, particularly Sophie. One really intriguing model that's popping up around the world are these people's universities, agroecological universities that La Via Campesina is doing, that's specifically all about training farmers. And I'm also wondering if maybe the community colleges are the place that should be happening. And especially with Obama's announced plan to make community college education free, then that gets around some of the just horrible problems that so many young people have who want to go into farming and are saddled with this huge debt. But I just like your thoughts on that. I don't have a clear proposal, but it seems to me that we don't have the system in place really in this country yet to train the farmers that we need and to get them up and running and in fields and on boats quickly.
Yeah, well, I definitely agree that our land-grant universities are failing, and a big part of that is that they're not training people to become farmers, but people in agricultural industry. So we're seeing a lot of land-grant graduates working for folks like Monsanto, which is a huge challenge. We are working in our policy platform. Our focus is on increasing federal funding for beginning farmer training programs. So there's a program called the Beginning Farm and Rancher Development Program. And I mentioned it's $20 million a year currently and it covers nonprofits that are doing apprenticeship programs, incubators, business training classes. It funds the land-grant universities. And I think $20 million is shameful when the amount of funding that our government is spending on subsidies like crop insurance and the support of commodity farming instead of sustainable farming. So in the next farm bill cycle, it's going to be a huge priority to increase that funding, but just securing that $20 million was a huge fight. There was a farm bill extension, so we didn't pass the farm bill when we needed to, so we had to have a one-year extension. And in that year, the Beginning Farmer and Rancher Development Program was not funded. So these programs that have been set up and have been receiving funding from the government were unfunded for that year and had to scramble to get other resources. So we united as a grassroots coalition of young farmers to secure that $20 million. So that's the first step, but in the future we're going to need a whole lot more funding for that program. And that program can funnel support into community colleges, which I think is a great idea. Touching on the liberal arts college problem, I think that there are sort of two time frames that we're looking at, which is our current situation, which is a lot of young farmers, the farmers that are trained and ready to go, went to liberal arts colleges or universities and need to be able to farm. And then there's the future, which is where people can choose whether they want to go to university or they want to go straight into farmer training. And I think that choice is really important and both should be viable. I think from a liberal arts education, you can get really incredible critical thinking skills, business skills, strong networks that can really help sort of make sure that our farming population are really well educated and really motivated by changing a food system. That's why a lot of young people are going to farming now, is they see it as a proactive way to change their food system. And I think an education that gives you the whole picture is really helpful in that. But we need to graduate with skills too. So I'd like to see universities offer more agricultural education, across the board, whether they're land grants or not. But I think making sure that people who don't want to pay for college for a traditional degree can have access to agriculture education that is not so one-sided and so conventional. So I agree completely. We just need to fund more federal funding to those programs.
One thing I would add to that also is just the opportunity for vocational high schools. So I think we haven't really talked about the role of high school that much, but I think there's really great opportunity there, but again, it very sort of under-resourced. So here in Massachusetts, we only have a few agricultural high schools, and most of them don't teach growing food. So it's similar to some of the land-grant issues where a lot of the training is going into, it's not that it's total agribusiness, but like horticulture or sort of the greenhouse industry, which really, when you look at a place like New England, that's still really what dominant agriculture is, the greenhouse industry. But I think we're seeing some really positive changes there with some of it is, I think, coming from greater awareness and pressure from students to say, like, oh, I want to learn how to actually grow something that I'm going to eat. And these are schools that have land to do that training. That's what their mission is. And I think where some of them have just in the past couple of years here in Massachusetts really started shifting to actually growing food. There's great opportunity then to connect it to the school out in Northampton. They're raising livestock and eating the ground beef in the cafeteria, and so there's some good models, but again, it needs to be really elevated, and there's more students wanting to go to those schools than there is space in the school. So for kids who live in Worcester County in Massachusetts, they're traveling like out to Norfolk County to go to agricultural high school and sitting on a bus for hours every day because there's just not enough seats for those schools.
I also want to mention the folks that are growing up on family farms that leave for college have found it a really valuable experience to be able to get off farm and learn more about the systems, to go back to their farm really revitalized, to make some changes on the existing farm. In the survey that we did of farmers, we got a pretty overwhelming response from second and third generation farmers who found college to be valuable, but then were having trouble going back to the farm because of the debt.
My name is Bridget, and I run the farm at Stonehill College, and so it's a small liberal arts Catholic college in Easton, Massachusetts, and it's interesting because the farm acts as this hub for students to start learning about the food system. So kind of that issue around liberal arts and the ag role, and I think there's a lot of value in having it, and I know that a lot of campuses that have farms find that too. To have that conversation. But one challenge I'm seeing is I'm getting interest, and students want to learn how to farm. They're graduating, they're facing debts and all those sorts of things, and I only have a certain capacity to teach them certain skills, so I'm looking for resources on summer experiences and after they graduate, how they can engage and become farmers. And you might have covered this, I came in a little bit late, but because I feel like we provide it to a certain level, and I think we can get to people when they're younger with kind of the vocational schools, and then maybe they won't have the debt because they won't go to the liberal arts college. They'll know what they want to do sooner. But I see value in having sort of more kind of networking and figuring out how I can provide that information to them. Summer programs after they graduate. And meanwhile, they're learning the Real Food Challenge stuff. So it's all great.
Yeah, well, youngfarmers.org is our website, and we have a really nice comprehensive list of training programs. So you can click on your region and find out opportunities for summer programs, internships, and then also business classes that you would take while you were starting your farm. So I definitely recommend checking out that resource. But I agree that working on a student-run farm doesn't give you the skills you need to run a farm, because there's so much there in terms of just production, but also marketing and the business side of things. So.
I've already asked. I'm happy to ask.
Hi, I'm Barry Costa-Pierce. I direct the Marine Science Center at the University of New England in Maine, where it snows in April, by the way. So I really appreciate you putting the idea of seafood in the center of the plate because of our cultural heritage in New England. I wanted to ask a couple of things. We think it's a public health crisis that Americans eat 130 pounds of meat a year and only 14 pounds of seafood, and so that we're not getting the omega-3s. So our university has decided to embark upon, because we have Maine's only medical school, so we're strong in the health sciences and in the marine sciences. We have, one of the things I wanted to stimulate you to think about in the Young Farmers program, we have plenty of water for training our students. So we own islands, and we have 3,500 miles of coast in the state. So we're absolutely dedicated to the port-to-plate seafood economy and the marine entrepreneurship programs for young people. So we have a tremendous opportunity for young people to get into aquaculture, sustainable ecological aquaculture. So if there's any way we can sort of think about that young people can get leases for seaweed, the seaweed economy is booming, the shellfish economy is booming, young people are making really good livings off of these port-to-plate initiatives. So I don't know if you're thinking in that way about, sort of there's some universities that are going to embark upon kind of niche development. We're not going to be doing, because we have a mile of coastline, that's our university. We're not going to be doing the agricultural programs, but we're going to be doing seaweed, seafood programs, and we want to see that happen. Like just last week, we worked with Sodexo to have a sustainable seafood week on campus. And Sodexo has just agreed with a number of Maine universities to accept all of the sustainable seafood that their universities produce in their training programs. So I would like to sort of interact as much as possible on the ocean side with young farmers. And I'd also like to get as much information as you have, Sophie, on the, if you have universities that have information on how much seafood they need, and what are the opportunities for the value chain and for some of our young farmers to be in that space. And thank you both for your work. You're doing tremendous work.
Yeah, there are farmers that are starting CSFs, community-supported fisheries. That's a growing movement. Bren Smith from New Haven wrote an op-ed in the New York Times about farmers not getting enough money from their work, and he's a fisherman. So we're definitely expanding the definition. We're a coalition of farmers and ranchers. Maybe we need to expand that definition, but we are really focused on rural issues. So we are starting to go down that pathway first. But maybe Anim wants to talk about the seafood.
Yeah, I feel very excited about, charged up about seafood right now. It's remarkable, of course, how different the ocean is from land. That's obvious, but how the issues facing producers and fishers can be really similar. So that we're losing, as has been alluded to already, like the small and especially the mid-sized boats and the small and mid-sized farmers, right? Especially in the middle range. That's what we're really losing, and it's partly because of kind of idiosyncrasies, like we've gotten focused on certain species over others, and partly because of rules that govern fisheries that disadvantage certain kinds of boats over others. What's exciting to me is the chain of discussion that I see happening between our students, let's say in New England, and with the North Atlantic Marine Alliance and folks who do the processing of fish. Like we had a fish camp in the fall and brought workers, fisher folk, and students together. And I think, in fact, this panel almost represents the future, I think, of where this discussion goes with producers, advocate, connected groups, students, faculty, universities. If we can design together the systems like an aquaculture program that then has a university buyer, that's a lot of where our effort is going. I have a lot of excitement about that.
I think some of the greatest innovation in the transparency issues are also happening in the seafood industry. So some of that is because of regulations, food safety issues, that there's just greater requirements for labeling of where stuff comes from than there is for produce. So that is definitely about to change. But I think we're seeing some really interesting very viable businesses aggregating product from small boats in New England, and institutions creating a lot of the demand. And I think it's important to mention the role of hospitals here. You talked about just the health case for seafood, and this is where I think hospitals have been really engaged partners in this and driving some of the demand, because there is a desire there to be serving healthy food in particular, and they've been early adopters of a lot of the local seafood initiatives.
I feel like I have to add that while we're in this exciting phase of building up this new kind of economy and new relationships, we also need to be protecting against further loss. And so what's on my mind right now is the Trans-Pacific Partnership, a deal between the U.S. and 12 other countries in the Pacific Rim, which would, in a sense, create courts where multinational companies can sue countries, states, or cities who have things like geographic preference for purchasing, or fair trade labels, or all of the stuff that we base our work on would be at risk, and I think further drive more farmers and fisher folks out of the business. So it's kind of like both, build the good and also keep stopping the bad right now.
Yeah.
And while you're moving, there is a day of action coming up in April to try to prevent Congress from giving fast-track authority to the president, which would almost certainly then lead to the authorization of the passing of this Trans-Pacific Partnership. And you can Google fast-track day of action to learn more about it.
Great, thanks so much. A lot of these comments are making me think of something a speaker yesterday said, which is that her children's school has a garden there, but they're not actually allowed to eat the food at the school. They have to give it away. And I was wondering if you've seen similar challenges in any of the places where you're working, which seem so contrary to the principles of all of these initiatives, and an added layer of challenge from a policy or regulatory perspective that, again, seems really unnecessary.
Yeah, I mean, I can speak to that a little bit, and it's sort of an artificial barrier. There's no regulation saying, like, you can't eat school garden produce in school meals. It's generally something that's put up, we've seen this a lot more in schools that have food service management companies that are very, very risk averse and worried about, sort of food safety issues, though there are very clear sort of best practices that could be followed to enable that to happen. So I think it's making sure everyone has the information that, this is an allowable thing to do, and then really sharing what some of those best practices are and putting pressure on the folks who are trying to put up those barriers and exposing why they might be interested in doing that. I think it really relates to some of the issues Anim raised about contracts and kickbacks they may have with produce distributors, that sort of thing.
I think we have time for one more question.
Thank you for sharing your work with us. Because this panel is on the role of universities, I wanted to expand the conversation a little bit beyond the production and the procurement side of it to, and maybe Gary, you'd have something to say about this, to think about how we get our academics and public health professionals more connected with communities, especially that are working on food equity and justice, to pay attention to the concerns of the community in a way that they can then develop co-projects or partnerships with communities and then write grant applications to help them with some of the causes that they're working on.
Sure, thanks for that. I can't speak for all activities at the university. I know, so I work at the Harvard's School of Public Health, the Chan School. So there are a lot of people who are interested. I mean, universities are interesting places, right? So we research evolves for many different reasons, and we constantly are in this cycle of, faculty interest. For faculty who are involved with community-based work, I'm one of those people. I mostly work on environmental health issues, a little bit on the food side. There is some partnerships like that happening at the school, either in my department or nutrition. They tend to, I can't speak for everything, so there is some activity on that front. Should there be more? Yes. Do things sort of come and go with the waves of funding and interest and individuals? Certainly. I think in many ways, Harvard also has the problem of being a little fragmented because of schools, and sometimes there's interesting work that individuals don't know about. The work here at the Food Law and Policy Clinic, a lot of that work, I think, is probably unknown to people who sit at the School of Public Health. So I guess I'm focusing on a lot of negatives here, but I should say that there is certainly, we've struggled with this over the years in that sometimes the way institutions are set up, especially at a place like Harvard, is that how faculty sort of develop their research and how they are judged and rewarded don't necessarily align with some of their core values and how they sort of entered their field, unfortunately. So, and that is certainly true for a lot of the folks who I know who work on health disparities issues, environmental justice issues. Certainly all these food issues cut across those. So having said all that, though, there are a lot of faculty who entered the world of their research with those values being the driver, are still interested in those partnerships, and sometimes all it takes is that phone call, that knock at the door, or that personal connection to say, you know what, there's a place where my research interests, which are driven by my values, and a community's interest, and that energy on the ground can do great things. And so I'll just talk about my own work. We've had long-standing partnerships with community-based groups who fight on housing issues, and we've worked for more than 10 years with the Boston Housing Authority, like on very specific housing-related issues where we're doing important research and it's feeding back into change. So, so I would encourage you or anyone else who feels like there's a gap, like there are community, there's community interest and a vision for either acting on the solution or identifying the problem. You know, reach out to your to academic partners who might be in their own little world and don't know about that activism, that ground work on the ground. So, sorry, I hope that answered your question.
If I could just add a little point related to that, I think students can be very powerful in pushing for those kinds of partnerships in colleges and universities. If you're aware of it, you can really help push faculty in that direction. So I'd encourage you to act on that front. And also, I'm a member of a network, the Interinstitutional Network for Food, Agriculture, and Sustainability, that brings together different endowed chairs and sustainable ag centers around the country. And the network is all about encouraging university community partnerships. So if faculty members, or if you want your college or university to be doing more of this, you might encourage them to join the network.
Did you say what that's called again?
Interinstitutional Network for Food, Agriculture, and Sustainability. Interinstitutional Network.
INFAS. I was going to say that, INFAS. We benefit from and partner. I'd like to be partnering even more with researchers, you know, both faculty and students who are doing research. Always open to that.
So unfortunately, I'm looking at the clock in the back of the room, so I just want to thank our speakers again for their time. And thank the organizers of the conference and all of you for being here. And I would imagine that our speakers wouldn't mind if you have a follow-up question. They probably would hang out for a few minutes. I'm sure they wouldn't mind.
Yeah.
Thanks again.
Yeah.
Thanks, Gary.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I appreciate it. I wish we had more time.
I do too.
Hi.
Yeah, there's